All right, good morning. Good morning. We have a little late start this morning. We had a hard time finding a particular adapter to get a computer hooked up. But we got everything finally taken care of here and up and running. So glad to have you all here. I'm Brian Mayer. I'm one of the co-organizers here, and along with Camille Mortimer here, as well as Matt Cordio and Abby Pobner, who aren't with us this morning. So we'll thank our sponsors before we get going. So we have our coffee sponsor for the month of March. So in the past it's been Jake Price with One Page Accounting. His sons are joining him now as well for the month of March. And they are with Berkey Realty as well as Milwaukee Realty. So acknowledge them and thank you. As well as my firm, Little Studio Creative, for taking and posting the video. So today we have with us Jose from OptikTechnik. It sounds really interesting. So he was telling me ahead of time about what this is, and I don't want to spoil it all for you guys, but about some optic technology for monitoring systems in wastewater treatment plants. He's been through the kind of the Brew Accelerator and has office space now over in the Global Water Center. And so without any further ado, Jose, take it away.
Thank you, Brian. All right, good morning. So it took us a while to figure out the technology, but I think we got it. Hopefully we're there. I'm actually going to control it manually. I don't want to mess around with the controls here and just further our issues here with the technology. But as Brian mentioned, I'm the CEO of OptikTechnik, young company, 1 year old, based in the Global Water Center. And let me tell you a little bit about our story, and then it's a very, there's a lot of background technology aspects to the application that I'm going to try and go through and clarify for you so that you get sort of the real gist of what we're doing and why it's novel. So let's give it a go. So everybody knows what this is. This is the Model T from 1911. It's at the time it was an innovation wonder from Mr. Ford. Around the same time, an interesting technique for controlling wastewater and water treatment plants was invented, and an apparatus that went with that technique. This is the apparatus, the jar tester. Now the big difference here is that while Ford cars have evolved a lot since that Model T in 1911, this apparatus is still the prevalent method for monitoring and controlling chemical additive dosing in water and wastewater treatment processes. 90% of the plants, industrial or municipal, rely on that apparatus, which is offline, manual, to actually determine what is the dosage of chemicals that need to go into the process. It's mind-boggling. So let me give you a little bit of background about how that apparatus is used and why it's so important. Okay. So basically, when water comes into a plant, either water or wastewater, to be treated, it comes in like that. It's turbid. The reason it's turbid is because there's a lot of suspended stuff in it. Okay? So what needs to be done invariably is you need to add chemicals to it. The chemicals actually alter the nature of the suspended stuff in that water. It's a process called coagulation. So then what happens is that the suspended stuff, which is very fine, that's why it's been suspended, aggregates. And it kind of flocculants, that's really the technical term. So it clumps together, and now as it clumps together, you can actually separate, either by letting it settle gravity, or you can float it with bubbles, or you can put it through a filter. But the thing is that if you don't aggregate these very finely suspended particles, you won't be able to separate them in the subsequent processing steps in the plant. Okay, so this is very important. Now, you can imagine that as the quality of that water coming in changes, which it does. Imagine, let's say, a water treatment plant that's grabbing water from a lake or a river. Whenever you have a rain event, that water is changing. And so what you have to do is you have to adjust the dosage of that chemical accordingly. Otherwise, you'd be overdosing and wasting money and creating a lot of problems for the sedimentation or clarification, the other units downstream. Or if you underdose, the same thing. You won't be able to settle things out and so on, right? So this is where that machine, that jar tester, comes into play. So what happens is when the quality of that water changes, the operator will take a sample. And by the way, this is how it's done. They have a little cup thing, they go in and they take a sample every 4 hours, every 6 hours, right? They run it up to the lab, they put it in that machine. Basically in that machine you have different dosages of that chemical in the 6 jars that you saw there with a sample of the water. And then there's going to be one that clarifies quickly. And that's the one that's, oh, this is the dose of chemical. So then the guy runs over and then, they dose the pump. This is how they do it. Okay? Imagine an industrial plant, cheese plant, for example, where you have, on-site wastewater treatment, right? And, in the morning you're making cottage cheese, right? And now you clean your units, right? And then in the afternoon you switch to something else, Howlett cheese or something, right? And now you clean your units. The quality of that wastewater between, the difference of the wastewater between cottage and the other type of cheese varies greatly. So now this is even more critical. So while it's critical for a municipal process, for an industrial process it's even more critical because the variability is so much higher throughout the day, throughout the week, or throughout the month. So the problem is, as we talk to people in municipal and industrial plants, we found a couple of problems. Overdosing is the biggest problem. Everybody knows that there's overdosing. There's even been published studies saying that overdosing in the case of smaller plants is over 50%. So in other words, using more than 50% over the actual dosage of chemical, that would be sort of the recommended amount, right? It increases the cost of operating the plant. So if you're using more chemicals than you should, you're basically wasting money, right? And this is actually, a lot of money is spent in chemical additives for water, wastewater treatment. It's almost $10 billion a year market just in that category in the US. It damages the environment. So of course, the more chemistry you use, the higher the carbon footprint of your operation is. And by the way, the chemical component in the plant is the largest contributing factor to the carbon footprint of the plant. It's not the power that the plant uses, it's not the solids management, it's actually the chemicals. When you actually do a life cycle analysis of the plant, that's the greatest contributor to ozone depletion and to the carbon footprint of the plant. So it has a very high environmental cost when you overdose. And then of course, if you're using too much chemicals, you run the risk of your water being off spec because you have too much stuff in it. These chemicals, by the way, sometimes are complexes of aluminum or iron. If you use too much, then your water might have an irony or aluminy taste. So you have to be careful about that. The counter to that is underdosing. When you're underdosing, again, because you're not separating the water properly, because you didn't aggregate it properly in those first steps, then you're going to have water that's out of spec. Or you're going to have your other treatment units downstream, like your gravity settler or your filters, not working properly, again, because you didn't use enough chemicals to clone, right? So that's really important. These are actually real quotes from real prospective customers that we've talked about this problem with in the field. The picture there is a guy actually adjusting the dosing chemical valve. Okay, so they've taken the sample, they've done it in the lab, and now he's adjusting it to what it should be. Plant manager of a big plant here in the city, he says that over time, when he started his job as plant manager, they were averaging about 90 pounds of chemical per ton of water. And through time, the thing has crept up, and now it's 120, and nothing else has changed, right? So he's like, I don't know why this has gone up, but well, one of the reasons is because it's entirely manual based. So you have operators every 4 hours taking a sample, going to the lab, and then the nature of the operator is, if this is enough, I just want to make sure that it works so I can get yelled at. So I'll just crank it a little bit more, right? And so this is what always happens. So in time, this is what you see. A distributor, a water services distributor here, which would be either a primary customer for us or a partner for us, this is what they say. They recognize it's a huge problem for the industrial customer. Remember before I mentioned that industrial water is very much more than municipal. That this is corroborated by what he's saying here. In fact, he's saying, look, even if you don't have a way for giving them a completely automated system, if you can find a way for them to actually monitor in real time what's going on, just so the operator knows, oh, okay, this is how the water changed, without having to take a sample and take it up to the lab, even if that's the only thing we provide, that would even be of interest, greatly of interest for them. So there is a need for this type of system out there. So how did we solve this, and why is it so unique? So what we've done is we've gone into the field of optics to solve the problem. And basically what we're doing is we're looking for a solution that is based on off-the-shelf components so that we can keep the simplicity level very high and the cost very low. Because one of the things is that there are systems or instruments to actually monitor what's going on in real time with a system like a wastewater. But the problem is that they weren't designed for this application, and so they're very expensive. The technology is very involved, and the instrument itself ends up being very expensive. So for example, in pharmaceutical processes, they use similar instruments where they have, let's say, a tank of pharmaceutical active, and they're crystallizing the active, and they need to monitor what's going on. It's very similar application to that application of aggregating the stuff in the water that I showed before. And there are instruments that monitor that. But the cheapest version of that instrument, because it's targeted towards a different market and because of the technological complexity it has, the cheapest version costs $90,000, which is clearly unaffordable for a water or wastewater treatment operation. They'd rather have pay an operator $70,000, and that would be one of their tasks, right? So here what we're trying to do is we're trying to democratize access to this technology by just following a different route. And what we've done is we're using the principle of light scattering, but basically what we do is we use an off-the-shelf laser, an LED laser. This is a very small, it kind of gives you an idea of what the size is. A very small laser, low power, not too dissimilar to one of those laser pointers for presenting. It's in the order of that power. And the reason we can use such a low power laser and still get enough information from the sample is because we're coupling it with the thing on the top, which is a rotating polygonal mirror. These rotating mirrors are the same components that you'd find on a laser printer or on a checkout register, when you have the little red light and you scan your barcodes. Well, the thing that creates that sheet of light is a rotating polygonal mirror, okay? So when you actually have a laser beam impinged on that mirror that is rotating at a high speed, you create a sheet of light. And this sheet of light is basically, by the way, the sensor would be immersed in the tank or in the pipe where we're trying to actually monitor what's going on. And so that sheet of light gives you an instantaneous view of what's in there, okay? And so what you get, you can't see it because the lighting is a bit too bright in this room, but you can see that those fine particles show up as stuff in an image, okay? And through some proprietary image processing algorithms that we have, which are actually very simple, from this image you can extract a number that tells you what is the aggregation state of that sample. So for example, if you're using too much chemical and your aggregation state is proceeding too rapidly, you can actually detect how that clumping is proceeding too rapidly as you're taking images through time, and then you can send a signal to your dosing pump to dial it down a little bit. And conversely, if you're not aggregating fast enough, right, you can detect that rate of aggregation is too slow, and then you send a signal back to the pump and say, okay, I need more chemical, and then that's the way to control. So I've described a classical feedback control loop, but that's enabled by having this sensing mechanism to be able to do that. That's what it enables. Okay? Otherwise, measuring what's going on in real time in the process on site is very difficult to do, and as I said, requires a very expensive means of doing it. So the idea is that we take an industry where today you have predominantly manual, offline methodology for controlling these processes, or for those plants that are rich enough to have these instruments, which are not a lot of them, you take the industry from that situation today to what we're proposing, which is based on our very simple sensor, which, by the way, this sensor, we can manufacture this for a cost of about maybe $400 or $500. The most expensive piece in it is the detector. So that image is generated by a photodetector, which is kind of similar to the photodetector that you have in your iPhone. It's kind of the same quality, right? So you put all that together, and then you have a microprocessor to be able to process those images. I think in the end, probably $500 would be sort of a cost of goods of that instrument. So from $500 cost of goods to, you know, an instrument that, you know, is sold for $90,000, there's a lot of room for margin. Meaning that you're probably thinking, well, you know, pharmaceutical uses a $90,000 instrument. There's probably a lot of margins to be gained in pharmaceutical industry if we went for this instrument there, which is kind of the plan eventually. So, so today, the jar test method, a manual method, is the prevalent one. So these are some of the companies that that provide them. There's some other alternatives I mentioned that are out there. I won't go into the detail, but there's typically 3 or 4 other techniques to do the monitoring. The problem with those is that, and you see that they're kind of placed low in the reliability. Reason being is that their range of application is very limited. So if your incoming water is varying over 2 wide conditions, then the control method, any of those 3 or 4 control methods, is not very accurate. So it requires still a lot of operator oversight. So in other words, you know, keeping an eye on the process to see if there's an excursion from that band of operation, and then the operator has to intervene manually. So they're not entirely effective. Whereby we believe that our process is robust enough to be able to be effective over all kinds of conditions that you encounter. And clearly I've described that, you know, from the affordability point of view, it's certainly the best one out there. So from the business side, this is how we plan on making money. So the obvious thing is the one-time sale of the sensor and the controllers, and then the installation and commissioning. So that would be one component to the revenue stream. Then on the recurring revenue side, the licensees for the control software and the image processing software, and then of course the parts and service plan, which is also a very enticing thing for our channel partners, because we intend to go to market through distributors, not ourselves. We don't want to build a sales and service organization because those already exist out there. And then the third part of it is consulting services. So you can imagine that once you have all this information, historical information on the process, you know, how the dosage of chemical varies with the incoming water, now you're creating a database which is very powerful for benchmarking plants' efficiencies, identifying bottlenecks in the plant's process, and so now you can bring a whole bunch of options for plant optimization that today, you know, today they're not available because all that data is not there because everything is manual. Okay. So it's that's another potential high margin revenue stream. So the company was founded by myself and Professor Strickler. Professor Strickler is actually a professor here at UWM. He's based on the Global Water Center. I think you know that, well, if you don't know, UWM has a series of labs in the Global Water Center on the 7th floor. And so Rudy has one of the labs there. I actually met Rudy, just a little bit of personal information. I met Rudy at the Global Water Center. I've been at the Global Water Center 2 years before we actually founded OptikTechnik. I have another company which is also in the field of wastewater treatment. It's called Microflood Technologies, and there we're looking at providing very simple, affordable on-site treatment for small industrial plants. And we're trying to solve a specific problem we had with that offering, and I met Rudy, we started working together, and in solving that problem we came up with this concept of solving the problem through optical means. And then we thought, you know what, this has applications not just in water treatment, but in many other vertical markets, and we decided to start this company. So that's kind of how everything came together. So I've been in the Global Water Center for just over 2 years now. Rudy is actually, he's a world authority in zooplankton. So, you know, you can say, well, you know, that's not very related to wastewater. It's not. But in becoming a world authority in zooplankton, he, I guess one of the reasons he's an authority in zooplankton was because he came up with some cutting-edge optical techniques to study zooplankton in their element. You know, how they interact with predators and how they interact amongst themselves and so on. And So what we're doing is we're leveraging that knowledge in optics to actually solve an industrial problem. So it's a pretty neat reapplication of sort of natural, basic science knowledge to engineering and practical application. And so this is where we are. This is my next to last slide. But people always ask me, so where are you? Well, I mentioned we're a young company. We're a year old. Basically, we're founded in February last year. And we started tinkering with this idea a little bit before that. And around March or so, we applied for the third batch of the BREW program here, sponsored by the Water Council. And so we're recipients of that, of one of the 6 accelerator awards. And then, yeah, we just filed a provisional patent covering the hardware and aspects of the software that I mentioned. This week we're filing an additional provisional, which covers some variations to it that were different enough that our attorney said, you should file a new one. We're in the process of actually building a prototype because we're gearing up for a field trial with Veolia Water here at Jones Island plant. And then our hope is that we can have enough proof of concept from that trial and then from another trial, which we're trying to set up in an industrial customer, because the Veolia one is a municipal one, and our 2 market segments would be municipal and industrial. And we're trying to set up an industrial trial also for the summer with a water distributor partner that we've been working with. And so hopefully by the summer, at the end of the summer, we have enough de-risking of the technology that we can actually go out to the next phase and get some money and try and commercialize our first prototype. So it's kind of the plan. Okay. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. So I know it was a bit technical, and I try to navigate that, but if there's any questions, I'm more than happy. Please.
How big is the potential market?
Okay, so there's, just to give you an idea, there's 16,000 municipal wastewater treatment plants in the U.S. There's about 250,000 industrial plants that have on-site treatment of varying sizes, okay? If you'd say the offering represents an annual revenue of about, let's say, $15,000, 15,000 times 250 plus 16,000, that's several billion. Yeah. So just in the U.S., probably about $2 billion in the U.S. It's sort of the total addressable market. Now, not all of those plants are actually using manual methods as I described. Probably 90% of them are. 10% are big enough that they can afford the $90,000 instrument and so on. The majority are actually using the manual. So the market is big. The U.S. is about 25%, maybe 24% of the market globally. So you're only addressing a quarter of the market globally when you just look at the U.S. as well. Yeah. Yes.
Where does this fit in the plants? Because the manual thing works because all you got to do is do this.
Yeah.
You now have to be within the flow or part of the flow of the water, right? So how do you the installation isn't just put it on site.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, this is highly retrofittable in the sense that the sensor, and I don't have a rendering of it, but the sensor, the laser and the rotating mirror that I described, it's probably contained in a head about, and I say probably because we haven't finalized the design, but it's probably going to be about this size, okay? Maybe it's a 6 by 6 inch by 6 inch box. And that, imagine it has a holder. And so the easiest way of actually putting it in the plant is these tanks where you actually add those chemicals and mix them, all the plants have those tanks. And so you just lower this sensor in the tank and just fix it there, okay? And then you have a choice, the connection. You could either hardwire to an existing controller. A lot of the big plants already have control systems. They call them SCADAs. And so a lot of these plants already have SCADAs, and you can connect with the existing SCADA, and it's just load up our software into their existing SCADA. That would be the easiest way. Or, if the plant doesn't have a SCADA, you can just hardwire the controller to the dosing pump. So they already have the dosing pumps for the chemicals. And so whereby today it's a manual thing, a lot of these pumps have the option to connect an electrical signal to it. So that connection is actually pretty easy. So the retrofittable part is not so hard. Yes?
So what have you done for validation of the technology? Because on your chart, you placed it very high
Yeah,
comparatively.
yeah.
So I assume,
From the affordability and reliability point. So here's the thing. So we have a lab prototype where we validated this concept of, can we actually use a low power laser with a rotating mirror? And then what we did was we took several samples of representative suspensions, so from the municipal side and from a local cheese manufacturer. So we took some waters and we actually took some pictures of them and did the image analyses and sort of refined the algorithm for the image analysis. So we can say, look, we can actually tell and monitor the variation of that aggregation state within real wastewater. So we can do that, okay? Now, what we're going to do now in the summer is, now we're going to take it to a real plant and then sort of have it at a larger scale. So, like putting the sensor actually in the tank and now doing that in a real environmental conditions, because what we have is done in the lab.
so did you compare in your lab testing of it, the amount of chemical needed to
Yeah.
fulfill the process
Yeah,
versus what would have happened if it was
Exactly.
all done manually?
you're getting to a very central question to the value proposition, which is how much chemical would we be able to save them by having this? The answer to that question we don't have yet. We will find out when we do our pilot, right? Because it relies on, it relies on the real conditions of the operator taking the sample and then doing what they do, right? And so for us to actually monitor manually, we know what the actual dose should be, and so for what we can say is that the machine can actually track what we know it should be, right?
That's what I'm asking.
Right.
Is that comparison?
Yeah. So the machine can actually track what it should be. Yeah, we've done that in the lab, right? So now the question is, how different is that
Right.
from what the operators is doing, and therefore how much value is there for us to extract? Now, we don't have the definite answer to that, but when you talk to all these plant managers, they all say, it's like that guy was saying, like when I started here it was 90 and now it's 120. They all know we're overdosing. I mean, we're overdosing at least 20%. They always say that, they all say that. They know, but they just can't affect it because maybe somebody, brings down the hammer and says, guys, we're overdosing, leave it at this. But then something happens, these plants, something happens, somebody gets yelled at, and so then, next thing you know is these guys, they go back to their old thing and nobody's there to monitor day to day because it's all manual, right? So, but that's what we need to find out. In some of these plants, we're going to find out, hey, you know what? Now you're using 10, 15, 20% less with our instrument versus what you were using before.
So aside from the environmental issue that you brought up with overdosing, are there human health issues that, aside from the environmental, are there human health issues that overdosing might cause or underdosing?
Yeah, not really. I mean, the toxicity of these chemicals that they use is actually very low. So before you reach the levels of toxicity that would be of concern, the plant just would have so many issues with it that it would be immediately apparent. You can't operate under those conditions. So yeah, so the answer is not really. Yes?
I thought it was an excellent presentation. My question is, once you have it in there, how much human interaction is there and how much is automated? And what kind of training does that person need?
So that's one of the value, key elements of our value proposition, which is the instrument can actually be operated by an operator with minimal training. Because part of the market that we're trying to reach here is the unsophisticated processing plant that needs on-site water treatment, but that's not their core business. So imagine a sausage maker, a cheese maker, they're into making cheese, they know how to make sausages. They don't know anything about wastewater. and their operators don't know anything about wastewater, right? And so, and they don't want to hire somebody that knows about wastewater. So this is the type of thing, this is the type of market that we're trying to reach here. So the idea is that because the system is so robust and it's so adaptable to the variations in the water that's coming in, that it can actually do that on its own. So you don't need the operator to go in and do that. Now, what's going to happen is there's going to be certain service tasks that are going to be required. And for those, we have a distributor partner that would be tasked with doing those service tasks. So for example, the sensor itself is an optical sensor, so you have a window through which you need to transmit light. Now that window gets fouled with time, right? And so, that might need, that at some point that might need replacing. The software will as we go and optimize the software, that might need upgrading. So there are all these tasks, but those are associated with sort of a formal servicing program. It's not something that we'd ask an operator to do.
Is there any plans you can capture analytics over time? Because obviously this is very real-time oriented.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, can you capture a trend?
Yeah. So it's a very good question, because one of our ambitions at some point is, I described a very simple feedback control. Well, one of our ambitions is to, through something called adaptive control, look at feed-forward type schemes. So meaning that you can actually use a sensor to measure what's coming in the water. And then of course you have the sensor of what's going in the tank after you add the chemical, right? So now you've got two important pieces of information that allow you to build a model that say, hey, this happened 3 days ago. These conditions happened 3 days ago. I remember that. So I'm going to set my chemical dosing to this, because at that point that worked. You see? And so now, and then if you're off a little bit, then the feedback corrects you. So all this is being sort of learned by the processor. Yeah? And so that would be even more powerful than feedback control, because now you don't have the time delay of the process. So yeah, with feedback control, you're gonna correct your chemical dose, but there's going to be a point in time, from when you deviated to correction, that you wasted chemical and you were inefficient. But with feed forward, it's efficient from the get-go, right? So yeah, so that's one of the plans. Clearly, that would be sort of another tier in the offering, right? Which would be higher margin and certainly more expensive. And then aside from that, I mentioned before, the possibility of consulting services. As you're gathering all this data on the efficiency of the plant, you can suggest other things. So for example, the efficiency of aggregation, of flocculation, depends on, amongst other things, the rate of mixing that you have there. So typically you have a big paddle wheel mixer kind of going around. So you can actually change that as well and make it more efficient to use less chemicals. So the combination of the RPM and the dosage of chemicals can actually be manipulated to give you even a more optimized dose. So no, that's another thing that we can actually affect. Yeah. Yes.
Is there an opportunity here for you to actually, for these smaller plants, to effectively operate the plant remotely for them, so there is only need for a very low-skilled on-site person?
That's our vision, and that's my vision. Remember, I described that I had this other company, Microflot Technologies. That's the vision of that company as well. To have an on-site treatment that has sufficiently low number of failure modes that we can operate it remotely, and that's the key. And so the key is, yeah, that utopia of remote operation is difficult because current technologies have so many failure modes that in the end you have to end up sending somebody there at some point fairly regularly because there's so many failure modes. So what we've tried to do here is reduce the number of failure modes so that then you can actually operate that remotely effectively. And if you have a service call, it's a scheduled service call because you know that it's going to happen. And so those are, as you know, much more manageable from the cost point of view because you know it's going to happen. You can send the individual there with already the parts that they will need because you already have an idea of what the problem is, right? So this is what we're trying to do here. Yeah. So connectivity and sort of leveraging the Internet of Things, that's central to our proposition. Yes.
Is there anything that has or may occur in the regulatory environment that may mandate the use of one of these techniques as opposed to manual
That's an interesting question. Difficult to answer because you might see that if the offering takes and there's a lot of there's rapid adoption and then there's a lot of documented cases where the savings of chemicals are such that the environmental impact is important, then you might see that, right? But for now, from the implementation point of view, there are no regulatory barriers for us to overcome, which is, to me, is the most important thing from the business point of view. Whether we can sort of leverage regulations going forward to favor our offering, that would be interesting. Yeah. Yes.
Are there any liability concerns where you're taking the detection and all the decision making out of the utilities control and their employees and moving it to your system and then kind of removing that human check? Are you then shouldering a certain liability for the results that they're getting off of your system?
Wow, that's an interesting question, certainly for an attorney. From my point of view, though, this would be no different than an automated process control. The real risks, though, are minimal in the sense that you're not introducing new chemicals that are unknown to the process. You're using what they do today. As I mentioned before, in answering another question, if you're overdosing, there isn't tremendous concern about the toxicity of these chemicals, but when you're underdosing, you will immediately notice that in your plant, and so you can't run under those conditions for a long period of time. So not having talked to an attorney about this, my feeling is that the risk of liability is very small. As I said, no different than automating any other industrial process.
There's testing downstream from what you're doing is there in terms of the quality of the water that's being used.
Yeah, of course, yeah, because what happens is in every wastewater treatment plant, be it municipal or industrial, you are subject to a permit. And in that permit, it states that you are allowed to have, X, Y, Z concentrations of things, right? And if you're over that, then you're in violation of the permit, and now you can trigger some fines and so on, right? So in order to ensure that you're within permit, you're always testing for these X, Y, Z, right? And so, so you always know what you're putting out as far as those chemicals are concerned from the regulatory point of view. So yeah, that's a good one. Yes.
Is everything that could be in the water that one would be concerned about optically detected? Or does it become that way because of the chemical that's put in so that it's starting to lead to visible particles?
Yeah, so it's a good question. There's a limit to what you can detect. So if, in general, if the stuff that you're trying to look at, if the size of that is smaller than the wavelength of the laser light that we're using, you won't be able to see it. So if the water is too clean, then yeah, you get no signal. But if the water is so clean, you don't need to add chemicals anyway. Right. So for example, water treatment plants that are pulling from a well, that water is so clean that they don't use chemicals. They just go to a filter or, so in those cases, that's not a target market, but that's the minority really of water treatment plants. In most wastewater plants, the water, the brownish water that I showed is actually clean, very clean wastewater. They're entirely within the range of application of the instrument.
This is just a clarification question. Your product isn't about making the water, as it were, clean or drinkable, right? It's about actually getting the sedimentation process to occur.
Yeah, but the sedimentation is a process that you need to use to get the water cleaner. Yes.
Yes, but just because it's gone through the filter or the process you're creating, it's not ready to drink on the other side of that. It still has all of its
because what happens is that the processes that I described is just taking the stuff out of the water, if you will. Okay. Now what you need to do is you need to make it potable. And with that, for that, you either use ozone or chlorine or UV light, right? And that's the final step. So when the water's completely clean, no stuff in it, now you kill the bugs, whatever bugs there might be. Okay, and that's where you use chlorine or UV or something. So we're not changing, this is a good point though, we're not changing the current processes in water or wastewater treatment. We're just, enabling them to be controlled better. That's all we're.
Got time for probably one more question.
To follow on to the gentleman's regulatory question, is there a body of customers out there that currently don't have to treat their water, that you could anticipate standards being increased, and people that don't even do this right now that would need to jump into this without any history?
There's a big market out there of industrial plants that actually don't treat their water, they just discharge into the sewer. And so specifically, if you're not generating any waste out of a list from 15 or 16 chemicals that EPA has, you're actually allowed to discharge into the sewer, directly into your sewer if you have an agreement with your local sewer authority. So for example, most small food plants don't have on-site treatment. They just discharge into the sewer, but they pay very high sewer surcharges. So for example, you can have a small cheese plant that might be, their sewer bill in a year might be $150,000, $200,000. Okay, so they don't have on-site treatment, they're just doing it. And by the way, this is one of the target segments for the company that I described, Microflood Technologies, are those customers, the small guys that don't have on-site treatment, but they don't have it because they don't want to run complex on-site treatment operations and so on, right? But rather than being incented to do so by regulatory, we can incent them to do so by providing a technology that's simple enough for them to say, you know what, maybe I'll put one of these units in, these guys will operate it for me, I don't have to worry about it, and then maybe I'll pay them $50,000 instead of paying the municipality $150,000. So that's the idea. Yeah. Okay.
All right, well, we always have one question that we finish off with every week, and that is, what can our community do for you?
Oh, wow. So one of the things that, well, first of all, I didn't know about the existence of this place. This is pretty awesome, actually. So you meet here every week? Yeah.
Every Wednesday.
This is very cool. So yeah, when I walked in and I saw this space, I was like, wow, this is really cool. So back to the question. So what can you do? Right now, my biggest problem is trying to find representative sites or customers that will give us sort of a broad enough view of the quality of the offering to de-risk it properly. So I mentioned, yeah, we have a municipal site lined up. We're working with a distributor to line up another industrial site. But the more variety of industrial sites that we can get, the better. So, if there's a brewing operation that you know of that has a problem with wastewater, there's a protein or sausage making operation or a dairy operation, we want to have sites in the different sort of sub segments, if you will, so that we can as we're designing and improving the product, incorporate all the needs of the different target segments into it. So that'll be one thing, leverage your networks to help us in our customer discovery and product development process. That'll be great. And then, at some point we're going to go seeking funding, so it'd be great to leverage your networks as well as far as potential investors. I mentioned that we're going to look for funds in the fall of this year. So at that point it'd be great, the broader network that you have, the better. So that would be another way. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you very much for coming to join us here.